It's actually the 12th of March. Happy 12th March, everybody. Yeah, I did this yesterday. Apparently, I lost a day over the weekend besides an hour. I just wanted to check in. We're still going on with John Scura. Of course, my stupid XM unit did track forward, so the last segment is actually the one after this. I don't think I'll be able to figure that out by the time I get to post this, but if you went through, you'll understand. Here we go.
John Scura, let me ask you something. This information is so rich and it is so sensitive. How far out on the clothesline are you and your partner Dane Phillips as far as being sent any messages being sent your way to stop what you're doing?
Well, so far nothing. I
Okay,
wasn't
good.
expecting anything. I mean, you know, we're small fries compared to those guys. I don't think that we pose much of a threat.
Okay.
Well, hopefully it'll stay that way. But, yeah, I wasn't really expecting anything like that.
All right, good. Well, it seems like I heard a rumor that Dane had a car problem or something that looked suspicious
Well,
once
Dane
upon a
had,
time.
yeah, he blew out a tire. You know, it would be fun to believe that somebody tried to assassinate him, but sometimes a blowout is just a blowout. He was going 85 at the time, so...
Oh, well, yeah, I've had him blow out before, and I didn't see any Men in Black.
So, yeah, I need more proof than a blowout.
Okay.
You know, like if a mechanic looked under there and saw, you know, what was left of a bomb or something. Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, do we dare ask, are any Bilderbergers in the presidential candidacy lineup?
Well, you know, I wrote this and researched it in 2010, which was well before anybody knew who was going to be a candidate on the Republican side. I know Obama is not, but as I said, he's populated his administration with CFR and Bilderberg and trilateral members. If I had to guess,
Oh, you went to the
I
meeting.
would not be surprised if any or all of the Republican candidates are members of one of those groups, except for Ron Paul, because he's the only one who's saying the right things. You know, he's the one who's trashing the Federal Reserve Bank and system, saying that, you know, we're paying them to print counterfeit money, and that's essentially the truth.
If the Federal Reserve Bank suddenly went away due to pressure from the citizenry, that Henry Ford thing about, yes, there will be a revolution before tomorrow morning. If there was enough hell raised about it, what do you imagine it might be replaced with?
Well, the U.S. Treasury Department is perfectly capable of printing American currency, and they would not charge interest because it's straight out of the government. You know, do you realize that our entire personal income tax money goes to pay that debt? Not 1 cent goes to government programs that we'd be expecting from our personal income tax. It's just the personal income tax, okay? During the Reagan administration, he formed the Grace Committee. I don't know if you remember that. The Grace Committee wanted to look into, you know, waste, you know, to see if they could streamline things. So they were looking into where the income tax money was going, and they had, you know, a horrifying report to give them after 1 year of study. They said it all goes to the Federal Reserve System to pay the debt.
Well, speaking of debt and speaking of currency and speaking of it being backed with anything, is it your opinion that there's anything in Fort Knox in the way of gold?
Nope.
Well, Fort Knox has not been audited since 1953, despite it must be audited annually under the Gold Reserve Act of, I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing. But anyway, yeah, it's supposed to be audited every single year, and hasn't been done for nearly 60 years. The U.S. Treasury Department consistently refuses all demands by lawmakers to audit Fort Knox bullion. Unofficial estimates, however, listed a 52% drop in the amount of gold bullion between 1958 and 68. You know, at the end of World War II, we had 700 million ounces of gold in Fort Knox, which amounted to about 70% of the world's gold supply. This was verified in that last physical audit. Now we go to 1968, and all of a sudden there's a 52% drop. By 1981, the estimates of the gold supply had dropped to 264.1 million ounces, and no one knew where the missing 400+ million ounces went. Some press reports blame the Rockefellers for manipulating the Federal Reserve into selling U.S. gold at low prices to anonymous European speculators. That might be true. But the source of this story, Louise Auchincloss Boyer, who was a longtime secretary of Nelson Rockefeller, mysteriously fell to her death from her New York apartment 3 days after the story broke, so there must have been something to it.
Really?
Understood.
Yeah, so anyway, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Grace Commission, it was in Reagan, it was the Gold Commission that Reagan formed. And a year later they came back and shocked the nation by reporting that the U.S. Treasury owned no gold at all. And this is, the early 1980s. And that all the gold formerly in Fort Knox was being held by the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank as collateral against America's national debt. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank does list gold on its balance sheet, claiming to hold it for the U.S. Treasury. But this could mean that the Fed is using the gold supply of the American people as collateral for money it prints and the interest it charges for that service. So,
unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. This institution has been a terrible curse. Let me tell you about how they've manipulated the markets sometime, because everybody thinks that the Great Depression of the 30s was just a happenstance. It really wasn't. It was manipulated. Once the Federal Reserve got into power, they expanded America's money right away. The supply went by 62%. Expanded, and a lot of it was used in bidding the stock market up to crazy heights. This led to a spike in loans to the public at the banks. In the stock market, there was a new type of loan called the margin loan, and investors with the margin loan only had to pay 10% of the stock's price to gain full control of the stock, the remaining 90% being loaned by a broker. The margin loans could be called in at any time, however, and had to be paid within 24 hours. So this usually resulted in the investor selling the stock. In 1928, a congressional committee discovered that the Federal Reserve Board was working with executives of European central banks to engineer a major crash. Evidence indicated that this plan was first discussed in 1927. During the summer of 1929, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Bernard Baruch, and other banking insiders quietly sold their stock holdings. They literally left the market, put all their assets into cash and gold. After this, the Federal Reserve Board raised the discount rate, and New York financiers started calling in their 24-hour margin loans. Investors had to dump their stock on the market in order to pay for margin loans, and this collapsed the market, creating what we know as Black Thursday and the domino effect of bank failures as depositors demanded their savings. There was no FDIC insurance back then, so people were actually scared that if the bank went out of business, they'd lose their life savings. This happened to a lot of people. The Federal Reserve did not come to the aid of the banks despite its legal mandate to maintain an elastic currency. Within 1 year, $40 billion in wealth had been lost from the stock market crash. But the banking oligarchs in Europe made a killing by waiting for the market to bottom out and then buying stocks at a 90% discount. Thus, the billions were not really lost. They were redistributed among the banking oligarchs. Those who have studied the episode are certain that the Great Crash in 1929 was scientifically engineered. Congressman Louis McFadden stated that the crash was a means for European bankers to regain the vast amounts of gold that they had sent to America during World War I to finance the English and French armies. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, blamed the Federal Reserve for the Depression during a 1996 interview on National Public Radio. So, and also, after the crash, between 1929 and 1933, the Federal Reserve contracted the money supply by 33%. As much as anything, this fueled the Depression. Louis McFadden, who was always a staunch opponent of the Fed and the European bankers, introduced a resolution to file charges against the Federal Reserve Board members. He also introduced a resolution to impeach the Treasury Secretary, his assistants, and the Federal Reserve Board. After doing that, McFadden survived 2 attempts on his life. One was a shooting when he was getting out of a cab in New York, and the other a poisoning at a banquet. His life was saved by a doctor friend who happened to have a stomach pump. He survived those two before dying under suspicious circumstances that were reported in the press as the flu. So anyway, that's an example of how the Federal Reserve can roil the markets and create depressions. We're in a Great Recession right now. That's what people are calling it. And there's evidence that this is manipulated too. It's all about redistribution of wealth on a massive scale. It all began in 1999, this new recession, when Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act that allowed banks to issue unlimited credit. Immediately, the media touted these schemes like derivatives and hedgelets, tempting small investors to gamble on mortgages. The initial returns were so sparkling that more investors, corporations, and independent banks and state and local governments began to invest heavily. In 2007, the bankers began to issue warnings that these trendy mortgage investments, might be in trouble. And at the same time, they stopped the flow of fiat money, which had inflated the real estate bubble. So the bubble burst in September 2008. And when Congress initially refused to vote for bailout money, the bankers promised an economic meltdown. It was financial terrorism, amidst the stock market crash where the Dow dropped 777 points, which is the biggest single-day drop in stock market history. When Congress still refused to vote for a bailout money, the White House joined in with the Treasury Department and threatened martial law. The Congress finally wrote the bailout bill, as you remember, passed it after having only minutes to see its final version. The Fed solemnly promised that every dime of the $700 billion bailout money would be accounted for. But just 5 weeks later, the Treasury Secretary announced that the bailout money would not be going to the troubled mortgage assets, as the bill intended, but to non-bank financial institutions and consumer finance. This indicates the bill was just a Wall Street coup, a blank check that to date has raised the bailout figure to more than $10 trillion.
And no one has gotten in trouble, no one has been prosecuted, nobody's been charged, nothing.
And the Federal Reserve has reneged on its promise to account for anything. It hasn't accounted for almost any of it. Much of the bailout money has gone into buying other banks, not to relieve the mortgage crisis, and this indicates that derivatives were indeed at the center of the crisis, because the banks didn't use the bailout money to issue new loans. They bought various businesses at vastly reduced prices due to the recession they themselves created. So the recession was engineered a lot like the Great Depression to redistribute vast wealth to international bankers and to supply an argument for a single world currency printed by a single world bank, just as J.P. Morgan's manipulated bank panics convinced many of the need for a U.S. central bank back in 1913.
Just jumping around here a little bit, we hear a lot about these connected people having affiliations with Skull and Bones. Would you like to touch on that for a minute?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, Skull and Bones is a fraternity at Yale University. I think they accept 15 new members a year. It's obvious that the members are all bloodline East Coast establishment families. And it's amazing who's come out of that. The Bushes and basically all of the shining lights of the East Coast establishment. I didn't try to make a very big thing out of it because still it's a bunch of kids basically in college, so they'll do goofy things. But it is pretty amazing that if you get into Skull and Bones, your future is made.
Unbelievable. All right. And now, how do we get from Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations and Bilderberger, after doing Skull and Bones in our kiddie years, how do we get all the way to the Illuminati?
Well, yeah, you have to go back a couple of hundred years.
Okay.
And, the Illuminati are much more ancient than that, but we're concerned here with the Bavarian Illuminati, which was started on May 1st, note the date, Mayday, of 1776, by Adam Weishaupt, who was studying to be a Jesuit before that order was banned by the church. He had help from William of Hesse, who was, if you remember, the original Rothschild's benefactor. 1773 records of a speech that Meyer Rothschild made to 12 wealthy Europeans in Frankfurt show his plan to gain control of most of the world's riches and resources. thereby controlling most of the world's population. His speech gave 25 instructions to this end, which I put into the